The war began with a misunderstanding. In London, America was viewed not as a nation in the making, but as a restless child needing discipline. British leaders believed that once troops landed and authority was reasserted, colonial resistance would dissolve. They imagined neat battlefield victories, swift arrests of rebel leaders, and a rapid return to order. But they were preparing for the wrong kind of war. Britain had mastered European combat, organized formations, formal engagements, decisive clashes between professional armies. America offered none of that. Instead, British soldiers marched into endless forests, muddy roads, and hostile towns where every farmer could become a fighter. Colonial militias did not meet redcoats in open fields. They struck from behind trees, vanished into hills, and reappeared miles away. There were no clear front lines, no single enemy stronghold to conquer. Every village became a potential battlefield. The British Army, trained for discipline and precision, struggled against an invisible opponent that refused to fight by traditional rules. Worse still, British commanders underestimated the colonists' determination. They assumed loyalty would return once resistance became painful. But each harsh measure only deepened resentment. Homes were searched, property was seized, towns were burned. Instead of restoring control, these actions convinced thousands of undecided colonists to join the rebellion. Britain's greatest military strength, its professional army, became a liability in a war that demanded flexibility, local knowledge, and patience. Distance soon emerged as Britain's silent enemy. Every decision made in London had to cross 3,000 miles of ocean before reaching America. Orders took months to arrive. By the time instructions reached generals in the colonies, conditions had already changed. Commanders were forced to act independently, often contradicting one another. Supply ships were delayed by storms or intercepted by enemy fleets. Soldiers lacked proper clothing, food, and ammunition. Reinforcements arrived late or not at all. Meanwhile, American forces operated on familiar ground. They could gather supplies locally, recruit neighbors, and retreat to safe territory when necessary. British soldiers, by contrast, were strangers in a hostile land, dependent on long supply lines that were constantly under threat. Morale suffered. Many troops had been sent across the ocean for a war they barely understood. Desertion became common. For American fighters, this was their home. For British soldiers, it was a distant assignment with no clear end. Geography slowly drained the empire's strength, turning every mile of ocean into another obstacle. Behind the scenes, Britain's economy was unraveling. The empire was already burdened by enormous debt from previous wars. Especially the 7 Years' War, Parliament desperately needed revenue, and America seemed like the obvious source. New taxes were imposed: stamps, tea, imported goods. But instead of compliance, Britain received resistance. Protests erupted, merchants organized boycotts. Colonists accused London of violating their rights. British leaders could not understand why Americans rejected policies that seemed reasonable to them. After all, Britain had paid heavily to defend the colonies from foreign threats. Now it expected repayment, but the colonists saw taxation without representation as tyranny. Each new law widened the gap between ruler and ruled. Worse, Britain could not afford a prolonged conflict. Maintaining troops overseas, patrolling vast coastlines, and defending trade routes strained the treasury. As the war dragged on, costs skyrocketed. Britain was fighting not only America, but also the limits of its own finances. What Britain failed to recognize was how unified the colonies were becoming. At first, the rebellion was fragmented. Each colony had its own interests, its own leaders, its own disputes. British officials believed these divisions would prevent cooperation. Instead, shared grievances brought the colonies together. Newspapers spread revolutionary ideas. Pamphlets like Common Sense transformed political arguments into emotional calls for freedom. The Continental Congress created a sense of collective purpose. Local committees organized resistance in towns and villages. Ordinary people began to see themselves as part of a larger struggle. Farmers supplied food. Women managed businesses and farms while men fought. Enslaved people sought freedom amid the chaos. This was no longer just a political conflict. It was a social revolution. Britain expected loyalty from colonial elites, but even many wealthy landowners joined the cause. The idea of independence spread faster than any army could march. Then came the turning point that Britain never recovered from: foreign intervention. France had watched the conflict carefully, waiting for proof that the colonies could survive. When American forces defeated the British at Saratoga, France saw its chance. Officially entering the war, France provided money, weapons, troops, and most importantly, naval power. Spain and the Netherlands soon followed. Suddenly, Britain was no longer fighting a colonial rebellion. It was fighting a global war. British ships were needed in the Caribbean, Europe, and the Mediterranean. Resources were divided, attention was scattered. At Yorktown, French naval forces blocked British escape while American troops closed in on land. The surrender of General Cornwallis shocked the world. It signaled that Britain could no longer sustain the fight. Yet military defeat alone does not explain Britain's failure. The empire also lost the battle for hearts and minds. British tactics often alienated civilians. Towns were burned, property confiscated, suspected rebels punished. These actions pushed neutral colonists into the revolutionary camp. American leaders framed the war as a struggle for liberty, portraying Britain as a distant tyrant. It was a powerful narrative, one that inspired sacrifice and endurance. Britain, meanwhile, struggled to explain why it was fighting. Order versus chaos was not enough to motivate loyalty. The emotional momentum belonged to the revolutionaries. Back in London, political instability deepened the crisis. Prime ministers rose and fell, Parliament was divided. Public support for the war declined as casualties mounted and taxes increased. Many Britons questioned why so much blood and treasure were being spent on distant colonies. Without a unified government or consistent strategy, Britain drifted. American leaders, despite internal disagreements, remained focused on independence. George Washington endured defeat after defeat, refusing to surrender. Britain lacked that same resolve. In the end, the British Empire did not lose America because it lacked power. It lost because it misunderstood its enemy, underestimated the force of ideas, and overextended itself across the globe. It failed to recognize that the colonies had already become something more than possessions. They had become a people. Empires can conquer territory, but they cannot easily control belief. And once Americans believed they were fighting for freedom, no army on earth could force them back into submission. Britain entered the war expecting obedience. It emerged having helped create a new nation. And in doing so, it proved a timeless truth of history. The greatest empires do not fall from external attack alone. They collapse when they forget that power without legitimacy is temporary, and that distance, debt, and arrogance can defeat even the mightiest force the world has ever known.